Alright, so I must bring to your attention a presentation made by someone named Robert Burke, because in this continuing series, I am essentially making a list of the various strategies created by people to raise the consciousness of humanity, and I'm talking about them. So I'm going to talk about what Robert Burke talked about a few days ago in one of his videos. And I should mention that he's got some pretty cool ideas, and you should subscribe to his channel if you're into cool ideas. So anyway, Robert does not explicitly say that we should do this to raise humanity's consciousness, partially because it's more of a monist statement. But let's be real, that's basically what he's talking about. And you'll see what I mean. This presentation he made is notable. So to summarize what he said in a really one sentence summary, unceremoniously, basically, aliens made us racist. And then to summarize a better summary, more in depth, he references work by these two people named Tom DeLonge and Peter Levenda. And one subject they talk about is something they call DNA consciousness, which seems to be similar to the idea of in-group preference or in-group bias. But it's not simply a psychological theory, it's a theory of consciousness, because it involves kind of like an ontological basis or a mechanism for consciousness, if you will. So this DNA consciousness is supposed to be a root cause for racism and bigotry, and he goes into heavy subjects like legal slavery in the United States and the Nazi Holocaust. He references the existence of monarchies being evidence of this DNA consciousness motivation. He talks about how the US government is racist, and it seemed like he was saying governments in general tend to be racist, or that Americans are racist because they're going to elect a white president. But I don't know, because it also seems like he was saying that we have a monarchy and elections don't mean anything. But anyway, his advice, his stated solution or strategy, was essentially for individuals to not follow authority figures and to break the rules. And one would be breaking the rules by not being racist, and that would improve your consciousness in some way. And he also places some blame on the education system for not teaching us about consciousness and ontology. And so that's the first thing that's interesting about what he's talking about, is that he blames the government partially, and the second thing is that this is basically caused by aliens. He suggests that this DNA, some kind of DNA consciousness thing is the motivation behind alien abductions. And he mentions the concept of aliens seeding the human race, and that idea is called directed panspermia. And the human race is racist because of this event. To roughly quote what he says, DNA consciousness is trying to ensure that human consciousness does not wake up to the reality that we're spiritual beings in a physical body. And he follows that up by saying we are not our DNA, and that DNA consciousness cannot love, or DNA consciousness is against or antithetical to love. So he basically says to love, he doesn't suggest anything like attacking the aliens or attacking racists or anything. which is good. So another thing that Robert didn't explicitly state was what his ontological basis was, but basically he was making the case of separation of body and mind, which is dualism. I find that a lot of people try to distance themselves from the current physicalist hegemony of the hard sciences, but in doing so, they don't pin down an exact alternative. They just say, I'm not physicalist, and they end up sounding like they're in support of dualism, or they support dualism without really knowing they are, or knowing the other alternatives, or saying so, like, I'm dualist. So that I find to be a major weakness of certain belief systems that are dualist, such as I'd put the electric universe under this category, as well as Scientology and Christianity in recent decades. And Robert seems to fall under that category. I don't know if he is a Scientologist. I mean, it's okay if he is, no judgment here. I mean, maybe I don't know, just so this idea is really interesting because it also gives us a possible opening for an explanation of not just aliens and UFOs, but also the weird hallucinatory stuff that a lot of time accompanies the subject. And I agree that questions about UFOs and aliens also need to be answered in the context of consciousness, because the subject is incredibly broad and full of nuances that are completely avoided by some big UFO people. Not going to name names, but if consciousness is discussed, then this weird word, interdimensional, is thrown around a lot. And I'm not saying that everyone who uses the word interdimensional is a government shill, but I do think that government shills use that word to mess with your mind. And I think that you should be aware, at least aware of that. Just be conscious of the word. When someone uses the word interdimensional, just say, oh, okay, they use the word interdimensional. I just want people to be conscious of the use of that word. It's a key word. I too am very suspicious of people who are linked with the government or any government. Not exactly sure what the playbook is here, but we have a lot of people out here that would agree with Robert and would go so far as to say that the US government is run by Nazis. But I also see people like that alchemist guy I talked about in a previous video who is supportive of the government because the government is against racism and nationalism. Actually, there's some guy in the European government. His name is like Claude Juncker or something, and there's a video of him talking about aliens, and he's speaking in like French or something. It's kind of hard to find translate one with subtitles, so I'll put a link in the description. Basically, the context is Brexit, and he's basically saying that the aliens don't want Brexit to happen. They like the European Union to stay together. It's just weird, and he's just like casually mentioning aliens. But I'm just pointing out this is just one thing that happened in real life where the aliens want globalism, or at least the European Union. Take that, however you will. Anyway, this discussion regarding consciousness politics or monist politics quite often is something along the lines of people grouping together by race. Is it good or is it bad? And what role does the government play in enforcing this racial preference or racial bias? Um, that just tends to be where the discussion goes, and that's what the Nazis were all about. The Nazis, their motivation was called national mysticism, and it was basically the discussion of how a race should use the government power to enforce a racial club, tribalism or whatever, and it had a magical end purpose. It was for the purpose of raising the consciousness of specifically the German people, I think. Anyway, um, I don't. I'm not sure if they were thinking of, oh yeah, let's raise all of humanity's consciousness. I think, maybe the reasoning was like, oh, we'll raise the German people's consciousness first, and then just kind of like lead humanity and like eventually raise their consciousness in like the long run. And you see that kind of theory all throughout history, even today in certain governments who are openly, that is literally their, like multiple governments today, that it's literally their their policy, their goal is to raise the consciousness of their own people and then rule the world, um, and basically, be like the priestly race, and that's not limited to the Nazis. That's going on all the time, everywhere. So I tend to automatically say that whatever the government does, it's not the best thing. Whatever they do, doesn't matter what their goal is. Just government did it. Nah. Also, I think that racial preference is ingrained in people. What I mean by that is it's something that happens, not as a result of what the government does. And I'll see if I can find this demographics map of Los Angeles, which I think is kind of cool, and it illustrates my point. I heard of a government study. I'm sorry, I looked for it. I couldn't find it, so whatever. But this government study that showed that in recent decades in the U.S., the group that actually does this the least, or is least has the least amount of racial bias or racial preference or tribal behavior, is white people. And when I heard that, I was like, yeah, that kind of sounds right. And I was thinking about it, and it seems it's just anecdotal. I mean, but it seems like the people who are vocal about different races mingling are European people with European heritage. And I say people with European heritage because you get into the argument, again, about who is white and who isn't white. Like, for example, you have a lot of Italians. For example, you have a lot of Italians who consider themselves white, but a lot of Italians don't consider themselves white. And then sometimes you get Italians who call themselves white one day, and then the next day they're like, "Oh, I'm not white." So, uh, and like for me, for example, I know that people people call me white. They perceive me as white. And there's like a lot of stuff that goes with that, like, oh man, he's white, and even though people know that I'm a nice guy, um, people say, oh well, yeah, you're a nice guy, but you're white, so you have like inherent racism, and and like there's nothing I can do about that. I mean, I'm just saying that there's people that say I'm white, and therefore uh, I'm racist. I'm not saying that I'm racist. I'm not saying that I'm white or anything. But I'm not gonna sit here and go like, oh no, oh oh, don't call me racist. Oh no, don't call me racist. I'll do anything. I'll do anything you ask. Just yeah. So so Robert mentioned something about the education system. They teach you certain things, and it's almost as if the education system wants you to think a certain way about certain things, and they teach you some things and they don't teach you other things, and it's like they want you to have certain cognitive biases. Uh, and the thing about cognitive biases is that you don't really know that you have a cognitive bias until you lose your cognitive bias. And that's many times have I overcome a cognitive bias taught to me by the education system. Like, for example, I heard about these two things. One thing I heard about was called the Balfour Declaration. I never heard about that in school. And I also heard about something called the Havara Agreement. I never heard about that in school. I think that's kind of important, and that I think they didn't tell me about that because I think they didn't want me to know about that stuff. Um, but those event. I mean, they have Wikipedia pages. So they could be lies, but basically, there's a progression of knowledge one goes through, and constantly, if you're going through this progression of knowledge, your worldview is constantly being disrupted as you learn new things, and and that's just how it works. So anyway, I think I've made my point there. Um, Aliens made us racist, so therefore try not to be racist, and we'll improve humanity. And that fits in very good in this ongoing discussion of ideas regarding monist politics. Thanks for watching.